Okay, welcome. It feels like months since I've done a session on here. It wasn't actually months. I spent about 2 weeks or so traveling, played at Atonal in Berlin, Sommery, did a workshop in Berlin, then went to Holland, did some family visits, and then played at Draaimolen Festival, which was a ton of fun. Very busy time, really nice festival as well. Just beautiful location, about 20 minutes from where I grew up, so it was nice. Feels kind of like a home game. Plenty of old 90s ravers that came out of the woodwork just to come and see me play, so that was really fun. But on the way back, or somewhere in this sort of mix of traveling and gigging and all that, obviously I caught the COVIDs, and was sort of tied to just staying at home for a good week and a half, I think. And I'm kind of like better-ish, good enough to just sit in front of a screen. So I thought I'll just sort of start up my sessions. I had to move a few things around, as you probably have seen, such as this one. I'm going to try and sort of catch up over the next few months, and sort of you'll see me a little bit more than once a month, but maybe like once every 3 weeks, to sort of like get you up to speed. Today we are doing the dreaded session 5 about mixdowns and premastering, which actually has become one of my favorite sessions. Not because I like mixing, because I hate mixing with a passion, but it's just fun to sort of discuss, I guess, one of the most talked about aspects of music making. Also, one of the sort of aspects of music making, I think, that has the most misconceptions. So I wanted to spend this next hour or so with you, demystifying the process a little bit, and also hopefully get you sort of on the right path to a successful mixdown. So that's what we'll be doing today. I thought a lot about how to illustrate the mixdown process, and I'll have a few sort of general remarks first. And then I'll take one of my tracks and just sort of start mixing it from scratch, just to sort of like cycle through the process with you guys once or twice, and then hopefully that will sort of give you a little bit of an idea of how to approach your own mixdowns. But as I said, I have loads of general remarks before we even get into that. When I sort of started to prepare this particular session, I was really nervous about discussing mixdowns, because I always felt that my mixdowns were kind of shit most of the time. And so I phoned a friend of mine who's a mastering engineer in New York, and asked him for advice and help. And he said, actually, you're really not that bad. He said that usually what happens is that when you sort of get more experienced in making music, you usually take less and less time properly mixing down tracks, because a lot of issues in sort of mixdowns have to do with problem solving. And so the more experienced you are, the more you kind of like bypass those problems as you are making the music, which means that usually at the end of the day, there's really just a little bit of tweaking to be done, rather than having to sort of start from scratch with no one has a track that sounds completely awful for the longest time, and then you have to mix the entire thing, right? And so by sort of having more experience making music, you sort of bypass these problems once and for all. And so the mixing actually becomes more like just detailing, So like I said, I felt really inadequate, because I've always felt like, well, I spent less and less time mixing, but that actually has to do with experience. The other thing I wanted to say was that a long time ago I read a book called Zen and the Art of Mixing. It's kind of like a famous book sort of a Bible for sound engineers, I suppose. It's not really that interesting because most of it is for bands. You know, the guy who wrote it mixed like all these kind of like classic rock bands like Foreigner and Chicago and stuff like that. But in the intro of this book is a really interesting quote where he says that mixing or mixdowns is conveying an emotional message through a technical process. And I think this is something that a lot of people forget because, you know, in sort of our realm or our world, it's filled with YouTubers that tell everyone how to mix down, what to do, how everything needs to sound. And what most of these YouTubers never talk about is that, you know, music is emotion, right? It's an expression of your sort of emotional idea. And the only thing that a mixdown needs to do is bring across that emotional message in an accurate way, right? And that's also why mixing in different genres is also a very different process. For instance, if you listen to a jazz record from the 60s, you know, usually you have like a quartet or something playing, and Miles Davis is in the front, and the drummer is all the way in the back, and the bass player is on the left, and, you know, piano on the right. But, you know, no one buys the record to hear the piano player, right? Everyone buys the record to hear Miles Davis play. And so in the mixdown, Miles is, you know, front and center because this is why people are buying this record. This is why people listen to this music, right? And so the emotional message of Miles is what the whole mixdown should be about, right? And whoever plays drums, I am interested in these kind of things, but most normal people are not, you know? And so very important to sort of think about that when you're mixing down your tracks is like, what is my message? And once you know what your message is, you can sort of mix towards it to sort of make sure that it works perfectly in that setting. Same with classical music. You know, classical music is all about dynamics. You have very, very quiet parts and extremely loud parts. And so the dynamics between these two things, you know, the difference in volume and how these things come across, also what's left and right, you know, panning is massive in classical music as well. So basically the mixdown process is tied to what kind of music you're making and what kind of message you're trying to convey. In our sort of world, I would say, you know, we have our message is usually the dance floor. And so we have, you know, we think about stuff that comes from the left and the right side of the dance floor, right? What is the stuff that needs to hit right in the middle? What needs to be mono, you know, kick drums, bass, etc. Stuff that needs to be in the center, right? And then there's maybe sounds that can swirl around or that can, you know, be a little bit more on the left or the right, right? So we also use the same sort of philosophy to mix down our tracks, right? Okay, so that's important. Another really fun sort of quote that I came across a long time ago was an interview with Object, and maybe I can pull this up real quick. He did an interview about sort of production, and he said that the mixdown is the least important part. And he says, you know, while there is a lot of merit in taking pains to make sure your mixdown is as perfect as can be, especially if you're producing music for big sound systems, a tight mixdown will never rescue a mediocre track. I would go so far as to say that the mixdown itself is the least important part of the production process. Given great ideas, melodies, arrangement, instrumentation, and flow, a few out of whack levels and frequency won't actually cripple the end result all that much. If you're tweaking a mix for hours and struggling to get things sounding right, consider that it might not be the mixdown itself that is at fault. Don't be afraid to replace or discard channels or elements that don't quite fit, no matter how long you spend getting them to where they are. And so this is a quote that I think people should just print like large and sort of have them hang on their walls, because so often people forget, you know, that really the tracks are not about the mixdowns, right? And I know so many sort of boring ass tracks that sound amazing, but you know, after one play, I just never pull them again when I'm DJing, right? And there's also loads and loads of tracks that have amazing ideas that I keep going back to, but the mixdown is actually kind of bad, you know. So this is really important to sort of think about. And also that last little bit is something that I noticed a lot as well. Like sometimes when you're struggling to get the mix to sound right, like there's like little bits that never really work, sometimes just mute them or like just discard that entire channel. You know, I've done that with tracks where up till the very last minute I was like, actually this whole entire conga line can just go, you know. And all of a sudden, you know, everything falls into place and the track is done, you know. So sometimes you're just struggling with stuff because you want it to sort of like cram it in there, but it doesn't really need to be there sometimes, you know. So very important to sort of think about that as well when you're mixing, like when the struggle becomes too, you know, too hard, then usually the problem isn't the mix. It's usually something else that does that sort of causes that problem. So that's a fun quote that you know, you can always think about when you're trying to mix something and get stuck. Okay, so object. Another thing that is really important before we go and dive into an actual mix is environment. And you know, obviously most people have like a little home setup or studio, or some people go to a different place to mix their tracks. There's all kinds of ways to sort of find this perfect, you know, setting. And I can guarantee you almost no one has a perfect space to mix in. And so you always have to make do, you know, with sort of knowing what your equipment can do, what it sounds like, and sort of go from there. And I did my first album called Great Lengths in, I think, 2008. And we just moved to the States, and our apartment was basically an empty apartment. I had no stuff. And so there was a cardboard box with a laptop, and that was my studio. And for the entire album was made on a cardboard box, because I also didn't have a table yet. So that's how sort of empty this apartment was. Sort of during the mixdown process, I was like, my ears are killing me because I did everything on headphones. And so I went out and bought some speakers. So I bought Tannoy Reveal passive speakers. They're like $125 each. So really like cheapy, but nice sounding speakers. And I sort of basically did the whole album on that. And, you know, that just sort of goes to show that you can make quite good sounding stuff on very cheap equipment. Granted that you know what the equipment does. And this is the crux of the story, because what often happens is that people sort of keep upgrading their studios. Everything sounds better, the quality is higher, the gear is more expensive. But what they forget to do is sort of get to know their equipment. And for example, these Tannoy Reveal speakers, they sound really nice, but they often exaggerated a lot of bass. And so when I would play these tracks out, I would play the tracks and no one could hear the bass line, because, you know, if the sort of speakers exaggerate the bass, then you automatically turn your bass down, right? And so when I'm sort of in a different system, then those bass sounds were just gone, you know? And so once you sort of start to like find out what the sort of intricacies of your equipment are, you start to make these little adjustments. So for example, in my case, what I did was I would just sort of mix my entire track, and then all the way at the end, I would just add 3 dB of sort of low end, because I knew that my speakers weren't really giving me that sort of response. And so with just adding that little 3 dB, I knew I was going to be in the right ballpark, you know, to send it to a pre-master or to a mastering engineer, and he could sort of finish it off for me, you know. The same happens with high frequencies. You know, a lot of speakers, and especially headphones as well, exaggerate these really high frequencies because they want it to sound nice and crispy. You know, you never want to sort of listen to a track and it sounds dull, even though some of those tracks are. So they usually, like, you know, sort of exaggerate these higher frequencies. I always have to think of, you know, these sort of car stereos, where we have a lot of those around here, where people come by and there's literally just only bass and hi-hats, you know. That's why a lot of the really good car stereo music is just bass and hi-hats, basically, right? Like there's nothing else happening. But that's always, you know, people just think that sounds good if you have a lot of bass and a lot of high. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is what your track is about, right? So very important to sort of figure out, like, what is your setup like, and what do your speakers tell you? And the way to do that is to compare. So you could sort of listen to stuff that you know really well on your speakers, then you go listen to it in the car, then you go listen to it on the earbuds, then you go listen to it on maybe 2 different pairs of headphones. Maybe a friend has a different studio. You can go and listen there. Before you know it, you start to sort of figure out and get a bit of a feel of like what your speakers are telling you. Another really good way is to have multiple pairs of headphones. I used several different ones. There's this sort of really old DJ headphones that I started DJing on. They're by Technics. This is kind of my go-to. Like if it sounds good on this, I know that I'm in the sort of right world musically. But it's not a very accurate kind of headphone. You know, it's for DJing, so it's not like super precise. So I use different headphones. Like I have these are by III, you know, that Danish designery brand. And these are more accurate and they sound really nice as well. You can listen to them for a long time. A lot less intense than the DJ headphones. But these are more for like precise mixing. I use like a couple different ones, and I usually alternate while mixing, you know, just to check on different headphones. Oh, this sounds okay. Check the bass line on the other one, see if that sounds good. Then maybe I blast the speakers for a little bit. But just do like different things just to sort of check if everything feels like it's in the right ballpark on each speaker. Because if it works on 3 of your speakers, then there's a good chance that it works on other people's speakers as well, right? So that's a way to sort of get to know your equipment a little bit. And again, I really don't believe that you need to constantly upgrade your setup to like ridiculously expensive speakers. I mean, a lot of those speakers will only sort of give you a little bit of a difference if the rest of the environment that you have is also perfect, you know. And so if you're in a wonky studio like I have with, you know, loads of stuff and it's not exactly square and there's, you know, glass windows, like there's all these sort of things that distort the sound in the first place. Like if I put $20,000 speakers in here, there's really not a lot of point in that, you know. And so just make sure that what you have, that you know it really, really well, you know, and don't switch speakers all the time. Just sort of live with what you have. Okay. That's very important. I also mentioned that, you know, trying it out in other people's studios or in the club is also very, very really good way to sort of learn how to mix. I used to sort of just play my music all the time. It's a bit harrowing, especially if the tracks are bad, but it does help a lot, especially because when you play an entire set of mastered material from other people, and you play your one sort of mediocre mixed track in the middle, almost instantly you can hear what the problem is. And sometimes, you know, I play like a little test mix or whatever, and, you know, as soon as the set is over, I can go back to the hotel, 2 dB here, 1 dB less there, a little bit of compression there, bum, and it's done, you know, because you hear it sort of in such an overwhelming environment. So every detail comes out perfectly if you have like a proper sound system. And so it's a very, very quick way to solve problems. And so this is why I always try to play some of my mixes live. So that's a really good way to do it. Another thing that I've learned over the years is that, when you're mixing, you're constantly turning the volume louder and louder. And this is because when you are enthusiastic about your track, you constantly start to sort of turn it up, right? And so the problem with turning up your volume all the time is, first of all, that your ears get fatigued, and so they don't hear as clearly anymore as, you know, when you have your sort of mediocre volume. And the second thing is that you don't notice that you're saturating all your sounds. And so sometimes, you know, when you get really tired and you finish the mix and you listen to it the next day and everything is distorting, basically. So always beware that, you know, as soon as you get that sort of tired feeling, or you're like, you see yourself cranking up, you know, channel by channel, then probably you're not really doing a very good mix down anyway, and it's better to just stop, have a good night's rest, you know, clear your mind, and then start over the next day. and with a fresh sort of mind, you can sort of mix way quicker and way better. So that's also really important. The other thing, and that kind of has to do with that, is the technique of gain staging, which means that anytime you sort of add compression or EQing or any kind of sort of plugins to your channels, you want to make sure that the volume, or like the dBs of the sound that comes in, is the same as what comes out, right? If you sort of open a compressor, like standard compressor, it always has an output button, and it's always like a couple dB already on there, so that as soon as you put the plugin on there, it already sounds better because it's bigger and it's like heavier and fatter, right? But that's not how you compress. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the sound that comes into the compressor and the sound that comes out is exactly the same level. And then you can really judge what the actual compressor is doing, right? And so, or whatever effect you're going to be using. So very important to always sort of keep those volume levels the same. And this also prevents that you keep turning up your mix all the time and sort of end up in this sort of like distortion heavy field, right? And so always make sure that you sort of gain stage a little bit, and it'll sort of make decisions of what to compress and what not to compress a lot easier if you actually know what the difference is between these two levels. And then the last thing I wanted to say is I always promote that people sort of make forward strides with making music, right? In sort of all my sessions, I'm always hammering on don't think too long, don't save 15 different versions so you can always go back to your old versions. Keep moving forward with music. Obviously with mixing, you have to be a little bit more careful with that, and it's always good to sort of A/B, right? To make sure that whatever you do, especially if you make big moves in the sort of mixdown process, that you always have an A version that you can sort of refer back to, or that you can compare with, so that you always know that whatever you're doing is either an improvement or not, right? And so make sure that when you're sort of mixing, you have at least a couple versions, so that anytime you do something major, you save it as a new version. So if you're completely unhappy with it, then you can always go back, right? So that's the sort of last thing that I wanted to say. So okay, recapping real quick. Like I said, you want to make sure that you don't get sort of stuck in details. You want to sort of have a proper sort of workflow. I'll talk about that a little bit. Know your speakers and headphones. Test with other people and other sound systems, and in the car, and as many places as you can, to sort of make sure that your mix is right. Don't turn up the volume all the time, because that will sort of just distort the end product. Make sure that you gain stage, so make sure that whatever main plugin you put on the channel, the input and the output has the same volume. And also A/B, so always make sure that you have an old version, so you can always refer back to the old versions. That's my general remarks. I know there were a lot, but hopefully that sort of gives you like a little bit of an idea where I'm sort of coming from usually when I'm mixing. Are you guys ready to just take a look at a track? Yeah? All right. Okay. Oh, hold on. There was a couple questions. Wait. Okay. What was that? Right? Yeah, here. Tend to match RMS or I usually just do peak levels. Yeah, I don't really know. I don't really have a reasoning for that. It's just something that I stole from someone else and just always kept doing that way. So I usually just use peak levels on the, on whatever VU meter you have, just sort of see that you have the same volume. Yeah. All right. Let's go into Logic, and I'll show you a track. This is a track I did good 7 years ago, maybe, called Cutting Tone. It was on my Osgood Tone album called Voids, and kind of the idea was to make something sort of UK garage-ish, like the beat was kind of meant to be sort of UK garage beat. But I also wanted to incorporate, and that's kind of like the whole album was also about my sort of drum and bass past and my sort of like darker side of drum and bass. So I think when I sort of wrote this track, I had like a little sketch in my notebook, and it said something like Digital Spirit does UK garage. That was, I think, the sort of idea. And Digital Spirit is like two guys that do like these sort of really darker kind of drum and bass tracks way back in the day. So that was the idea of the track. I don't know if it sort of made sense, but I'll play you a little bit of it just to sort of so that you have like a little bit of a feel for it, and then we'll go and talk mixdowns. Okay, here we go. Right, that's the track. Like I said, it was for an album on Osgoodtone, and the A&R manager for Osgoodtone called this track the Law and Order track because of this sort of massive stab sound right here. I don't know if you know the intro to Law and Order, but it has exactly that sort of stab sound. I didn't sample it from there, but yeah, it just sounds a lot like it, so they called it the Law and Order track. But yeah, let's sort of go into the weeds a little bit. Like I said, you know, with mixdown, I think the biggest problem that people often have is that, you know, the mixdown process is kind of like a gray area between you making all the music and delivering it for a label or, you know, something. And there's like this sort of giant, like weird space, and not a lot of people know whether there is a beginning or an end to a mixdown, because people, you know, endlessly tweak and sort of try and make stuff better all the time. But you know, what is you need like a little bit of a sort of more analytical workflow, I think, for mixing. It feels something that is a little bit more sound related rather than sort of creativity related, right? And so what I want to do is sort of break down that process a little bit, so to give you like a little bit of an idea of how to approach it, but also when you are done, which is very important. So in this case, when I'm sort of making music, usually you know, I have like a sort of details phase where I add like the last like little bits of automation and, you know, some little edits and stuff like that. And then I sort of go into proper mixdown mode, and usually I have a good night's sleep to have like fresh ears to do that. And then you know, in the early morning I just start, and the first thing you want to do is sort of organize your track. And in this case, you know, I have all my sort of channels. I try to sort of color all my channels by sort of like style. That's really, really important, just because you don't have to spend a lot of time looking for certain channels or looking for stuff when you're in the mixdown process. In this case, what I do is, you know, I sort of group stuff by style. So I have like a drum group, I have a hi-hats group, I have my bass always separate, I have some sort of sounds or chords or melodic elements separately, and then usually leftovers is stuff like little sounds and like bleeps and things like that, right? And so in this case, for example, you know, these sort of pink sections here are my drums. Then these purple ones are all my hi-hats. Then I have my bass, obviously, sub bass. Very simple sub bass. Then my Law and Order stab. And a little edit of it. And then the rest is basically just like separate sounds, some strings and things like that, as you can hear here. Let me see. I think that's from some anime movie or something that I found. And so these are kind of like the main groups, and this is important because the way I sort of usually mix is I want to make sure that there is a basic sort of level for each of the groups, and then once I have the group sort of sitting right, I can go sort of deeper into detail. So in this case, and this is something you can do in Ableton as well, you know, I sort of have my groups and sort of send them all to one particular channel. And I'll sort of highlight those here. Those are these yellow ones over here. And as you can see, I labeled them with highs, kick, snare, stabs, sounds, and bass. So these are like my 6 main groups that sort of comprise the track, right? And so now I'm going to do something really scary. Usually when you're sort of like tinkering away on the track, and you know, you really feel like you've got something good, and you know, it sounds good already and it sounds convincing, you don't want to change things too much, but what I usually do when I start with fresh ears is also start with a fresh mixer, and so I yank everything to 0, and so now we have no mixdown whatsoever, we have no track, right? And so this is important because it gives me almost immediately like a fresh slate. And now I know, like now I'm sort of trying to sort of make this track sound good and not worry about the notes, about, you know, the sound design, about the automation or anything like that. Now we're just mixdown mode, right? And the way I do it, and this has to do with the fact that you always want to mix from a sort of emotional perspective, is, you know, the most important part in my tracks most of the time, if I'm doing a dance floor thing, is kick drums and bass, right? And so what I do is I want to make sure that that's kind of like the anchor on which the rest of the mix, I can hang the rest of the mix onto it. So in this case, what I do is I take my kick drum channel right here, this one, and I set it to 0 dB, like that. Oh, 0. And what I do is in the track I take the busiest section where all those sections or all those elements of the track are represented properly, because if I can get that to sit right in that busy section, then usually that translates to the rest of the track as well. Because you don't want to sort of mix something and it sounds super powerful in the intro, but then as soon as the bass hits, the whole track falls apart, right? So you want to make sure that you always pick like a really busy section where there's a lot going on, It makes it a little bit harder to mix that section, but once you have that right, you don't have to do much work on the rest of the track. So in this case, I sort of loop a little part where there is bass, there is the stab, there is all my drums, and there is a string, so I have all the elements. And I'm just gonna go and set this on loop with only the kick open. And then in order of importance in my track, so remember again that sort of emotional message that you're trying to convey. So in order of importance, you want to sort of mix stuff into this kick drum. So in this case, you know, I need to have my snares and my drums sort of to fill out the kick drum. Then I'll add the highs, then I'll add the stabs, because this track is really about the stabs. Then my sub bass to sort of support the stabs, and then the sounds as a last, because, you know, that's kind of like details, little things that sort of are sitting on the top, right? So let's just go ahead and see what we can do. So this first sort of like phase of leveling the main elements of the track, you want to do that at the same volume, right? So you don't change the volume of the speakers or your headphones, you know, just try and sort of do it at the same volume so that it makes it much easier to sort of level a little bit. And so once you sort of tinker around with this a little bit, don't take too long to do that. It's more like broad strokes, right? You'll already have like a little bit of a feel of where the track is going, right? So now if I listen to it, so it feels like I've done a lot of work already, even though I just spent 30 seconds, right? So really good to sort of do that sort of basic leveling, you know, get those main groups to sit right first, and then we can go problem solve and go into details, right? So once we sort of have this done, you know, this should take like, I don't know, 15 minutes maybe, where you just play around with all these elements to make sure that you have a sort of semi-decent mix. Then you want to go, again, in order of importance in the track, and sort of look at EQing. And I'm a massive proponent of reductive EQing, as they call it, where you know, you sort of use a lot of sounds, but as soon as you start to EQ, what you want to do is not add frequencies, but always take away frequencies. And this is really important, because usually when you add frequencies to a sound, it immediately starts to saturate those frequencies. It starts to, like, you know, it's kind of like a JPEG that you sort of turn the contrast up. It almost immediately becomes ugly, right? And so what you want to do is sort of like carve those sounds and make sure that they all have their sort of place in the mix. And obviously, when I start with a kick drum, my kick drum in this case, you can see the EQ, right? Okay, so in this case, what I want to do is I just solo and sort of see what my kick drum is doing. And as you can see, there's a lot of low end, like it's quite heavy. And then it has this really loud punch around sort of between 100 and 200 hertz. That one. And this sounds fine soloed, but obviously when you start to involve all these other elements in the track, they start to sort of like interfere with these kick drums, right? And so what you want to do is sort of EQ the kick drum and sort of make sure that you only have the frequencies that you're looking for in the kick drum, and just get rid of the rest because you don't need it. So in this case, that really low kind of sub, I don't really want that because I know there's also a bass line coming, and then that bass line needs a little bit of room to breathe. And so I rolled off everything sort of below 70 hertz. And also that sort of punchy sound on the kick drum for me was a little bit too loud in the mix, and so you can sort of take that down by just sort of pulling that frequency field down a little bit. I'll play you it, and then I'll sort of play around with this little sort of punch, and you can hear the difference. Right, so there's quite a big difference if that sort of frequency is pushed up a little bit. So I want to sort of take that out a little bit and sort of just organize my drum. Then I go to my the section with all the snares and like little hi-hats and stuff like that. This one. And I'll just do the same thing. So I just pull up an EQ. This is just all stock Logic stuff, but you can do this with any EQ, obviously. And you see that a lot of this sort of action happens around 1K, right? And 1K is fine. You know, that's like a nice sort of body for a snare and for all these kind of like percussive sounds. Usually when it becomes a little bit harsh, if that frequency goes up to like 3 or 4, that's usually that sort of like beep in your ear on a bad sound system, you know, when you have like a bad night out. That's usually because these frequencies are pushed. So when you're sort of working on the mixdown, you always want to make sure that this particular section here is not too loud. You always want to sort of be very gentle here because, you know, when you listen to that 100 times louder on the sound system, it's gonna hurt, you know. So in this case, it seems kind of tidy, like most of it centers around this 1K. And then sort of there's a little bit of lower end here for like the snare and for the claps. See? And usually what I do as well with snares is I just sort of roll off a lot of these top frequencies, because in most of my tracks, when those snares are being played, there's usually hi-hats sitting on the top of those as well, or something that has a higher frequency. And so I don't necessarily need to make these snares like super fancy sounding, because you don't hear them soloed in the track most of the time, right? You only hear them in combination with hi-hats or with other stuff. So usually I can sort of like roll off quite a bit of that, and that saves me a little bit of headroom that I need later on in the mix for other stuff. So in this case, I'll sort of take that out a little bit, like that. And then when the hi-hats are on the top, it still sounds, you know, just as fresh, right? Okay, so that's how I sort of usually do it with snares. Sometimes when you have samples for snares, that could be like a little bit of vinyl rumble, or that could be like some really, really low frequencies that you don't necessarily hear, but they could be there, right? And so in that case, you also want to roll off these lower frequencies, because that's kind of where your kick drum lives and your sub bass, right? So there's a little bit around that sort of 100. And so with reductive EQing, you can sort of clean those frequencies up a little bit so that you have a more cleaner sort of sound. And what usually happens is when you have these kind of, when you sort of EQ this way, you basically gain a little bit of volume, like a little bit of loudness, because all those sort of excess frequencies are sort of rolled off. And so that sort of brings out the rest of the sound a little bit, right? And so by sort of going channel by channel, you sort of clear up all these frequencies a little bit more. And that will give you like a couple extra dB right off the bat without having to do any sort of compression or limiting yet. So in this case, snares, then I go to my hi-hats. That's usually pretty quick. As you can see, most of the action here happens in that sort of 2K to 8K world. Again, you want to be gentle with that. You don't want to sort of make that 4K frequency too harsh. Usually I sort of roll off quite a bit at the very, very top as well. First of all, because a lot of music that I do is going to be on vinyl. And on vinyl, they never really cut really, really high frequencies above 15K. And if they do, what happens often is that after a few plays on a record, those sort of top frequencies kind of disappear anyway. And so you may as well just roll them off beforehand. And it also gives you a little bit more loudness as well. Also, in a lot of soft synths, you have that really sort of digital kind of sound, or like a FM synths especially. They have like a lot of like harsh frequencies going on in that sort of 8 to 20K world. And so you always want to make sure that even in the sounds, you always want to roll them off a little bit more, because really you don't need them for the type of music that we have, Lotus sound systems as well, they don't really go anywhere beyond sort of 15K, 16K anyway. And so, might as well just sort of roll it off. Then we go from highs to sort of the most important part, which is the stab. As I said, you always want to make sure that you mix, the most sort of important part of the track sort of front and center. So let's take a look at this stab sound. As you can see, this is a big sound, right? It has a lot of low frequency, which kind of sits in that same world as the kick drum, so that could be a problem. And it has a lot of sort of mid-range, which is that kind of like punchy sound and a little bit of the melodic content that the stab has as well. And so because this is the biggest part of the track, like this is what the track is about, I don't touch it as much maybe as I would other frequencies, because this is sort of what I'm going to be mixing around, right? So in this case, I did just a few tweaks. I made sure that I sort of cut off a lot of the low end, because that's where my sub bass is sitting. And the sub bass is actually sitting in exactly the same note as the stab, and so it's sort of supporting that. So I don't really need any low frequencies here. Then I gave it a little bit more of a sort of warmer sound between 100 and 200. That's that little bump here. And then I don't really need any high frequencies, because that's where my hi-hats live and my other sounds and stuff. So this particular stab doesn't really need that frequency. So that sort of 200 thing here is kind of like the punch, like that sort of like pocky kind of sound, that sits there. All right. The last group is my sub bass, which it's not the last group, but the more important group. This can usually get a little bit funky, but you can do a lot with EQing before you even start compressing or sidechaining or any of that. So my sort of go-to is always to try and solve whatever issue you run into with EQing first. And if that doesn't work, then you can go to sort of the next step, which is, there's a few little tricks that you can sort of pull to have sub signals sound nicely with your kick drum and with the rest of the track. In this case, let's just sort of take a look real quick at the frequency. So this is just like a really, a sub bass with almost no attack and with no kind of like mid-range information almost. Here it is. See, if you have like a bass sound that has, for example, more like a mid-range growl or something that is more harmonic, then you would have more action in this particular area, right? But since this one is just supporting that big stab sound, I only have sub bass. See? And this is very, very low, like 40, 50 hertz is really just more of a vibration rather than a note. And so in this case, what I want to do is make sure that that particular note is isolated. And so, for example, if you have a bass line with 2 or 3 different notes, what I usually do is sort of look at where those notes are peaking, like what frequencies are those notes at. See, here's one, there's one here, right? So there's like one at 42 and then maybe one at 50 and one at 60, right? Those 3 notes. And so what you want to do is just isolate those particular frequencies and get rid of the rest. And so the way I did that in this case was like that. Again, like reductive EQing. So this space here is exactly where those 3 notes are sitting. This is like a little bit of the attack of that sound, you know, to give it like a little bit more body. And the rest is basically non-existent in frequencies. See? And the reason why I sort of EQ'd off all this stuff around sort of 100 hertz is that that's exactly where my kick drum lives, right? And so by sort of getting rid of these frequencies here, you can sort of, you don't have to turn up your kick drum so loudly, because it has more room to breathe now in the frequency field. And so the sub bass will not interfere with the kick drum. So if I play them together, so you hear them like interfering a little bit sometimes, you know, where the kick drum feels like it's sort of bumping into the sort of sub bass sound. But if I would sort of pull it up, you can see that it immediately starts interfering. And so by sort of clearing out these frequencies here, that's how you sort of create the room for the kick drum to sort of sit. Isn't that what sidechaining is for? Yes and no. I think it depends a little bit on what you want to achieve in the mix. Sidechaining is good because it works sort of automatically, right? And so anytime the sort of sidechain, you know, when a sort of kick drum comes in, it sort of automatically pushes away the sub bass, for example. So it does basically this, but automatically. I would say that if you can sort of solve that problem with just EQing, it's a little bit cleaner sounding in my opinion, and also you're not sort of subject to whatever the sidechain compressor sounds like, because it's just strictly EQing, right? And so this is just like a slightly cleaner way to solve that problem. If it's still a problem after, you know, doing all the EQing, then I could say, well, maybe this would be a good time to sidechain. But I try to stay away from sidechaining most of the time, and just sort of solve the issue first with EQing, because most of the time people that, well, not you, but obviously people that use sidechaining sometimes are just a little bit too lazy to clean up their channels by just EQing. And so in this case, yeah, I would say just do all the EQing first, and really if you run into any problems after that, then sidechaining is a good way to solve it. There's other ways as well, by the way. So you know, a lot of people sort of move, for example, their bass sounds up a little bit so they never sort of hit at exactly the same time as a kick drum. That can also sort of help, and you know, you can't really hear the difference in the mix. So there's different ways to sort of solve the problem. All right, so once I have that sort of sub bass sitting right, the only thing I need to do is my sounds. And this is usually where I start thinking about stereo and things like that, because most of the elements so far that we have been working on have been mono. You know, my bass and my sort of kick drums are always mono. So let me just play this real quick, and then we'll talk about what to do with my sounds. So my sounds are usually where sort of stereo comes into play, and I usually try and sort of not use any stereo on low frequencies, because this is where you can get these sort of phasing issues sometimes, or they start to interfere with other frequencies that you have in these lower in that lower field, and so I usually roll off most of that, and especially anything below, say 200 or whatever. You don't really want to have any sort of sounds there. The same goes for these really high frequencies, again, because most of the time that sort of high frequency is taken up by hi-hats or rides or anything like that. And so I'm not really looking for these really sort of super high frequencies in my sounds. And when it comes to sort of stereo, there are like some sort of like standard rules that you can use for stereo field. And I usually use a little diagram for that. Let me quickly show you that. That's this one. So this is really for bands, but it's kind of like a standard way of sort of approaching stereo field when you're sort of thinking about mixing. So the middle of the graph is mono, and as you can see, kick drums, snares, and the sort of lowest frequency bass sounds are sitting in this mono field. That's also, when it comes to sort of dance music, if you're in a venue, wherever you are in the venue, you want to hear the drums and the bass together, and not one after the other, and so it's important that if you have everything mono, then everything arrives at the same time in your eardrums and in your body, and so this is why we usually go for mono. Another reason is physical reason, which is that if you sort of press stuff on vinyl, the sort of needle moves sort of left and right to sort of catch all the information of the sound, and if something is stereo, the needle moves left and right further. And so if you have very loud sounds and the needle moves left and right, it also is more likely to skip to the next groove, which is bad because then the record skips. And so usually you want to have those really loud and low frequencies as mono so that the needle stays in the same groove. So there is like a physical reason for sort of dance music having basically a mono bottom end. Then when it comes to sort of, if you have like layered bass sounds, or in this case, my sort of main stab in the track, we call that top bass. And as you can see, you can do a little bit of panning there. Sometimes people use effects, like a reverb or a delay or something like that. And usually those are like slightly stereo. So that sort of gives it like a little bit more of a wider sound. You don't want to go overboard with stereo on the sort of top bass sounds, because then it's less punchy, but a little bit is always fine. And then as you can see, sort of when you go further out to the left and right, you see all the synths, right? Like lead synths, bell synths, pianos, they're all like mixed very widely with like loads of stereo sounds, so it gets that sort of warmth and that sort of all-encompassing type of sound. And so in my case, for example, in this track, those sort of screechy pads and the anime samples that I had in the track, those could be sort of more stereo. You can sort of control that with various plugins, just to sort of give the track a little bit more width, whereas most of the sort of bottom end is basically strictly mono. Does that kind of make sense? In this case, it says here vocals. This would be vocals if it was like a proper song, because they often mix those kind of vocals as mono, so that you can actually hear the lyrics properly. If you listen to like modern pop productions, like pop songs or whatever, you'll hear that the main vocal is usually mono, and then all the ad-libs, all the harmonics, all the sort of different takes and stuff, they are sort of like panned to the left and right, so it gives this really full kind of sound, but the main vocal is always mono, so you can hear what they're saying, right? So that's this vocals, not vocal snippets or something like that, right? Okay, so this is kind of a good graph to sort of keep in mind when you're struggling with stereo field, just to sort of give you an idea of where everything should be in the mix. Okay. All right. Let's go back to my track. Okay. All right. I see some questions. I'm gonna go to all of them. Hold on. Okay. So as far as sort of stereo, oh yeah, in general, you would avoid having certain sounds only coming from left or right, for example. Not necessarily. It's more about what kind of frequencies those sounds inhabit. So you want to make sure that none of the sounds that you do that with are too low, basically. You know, anything that sort of sits under 200 hertz, you don't want to sort of mess with stereo, and also because it will probably interfere with a lot of the main elements of your track, right? But I have worked, for example, with you know, you can, for example, have hi-hats or shakers or stuff like that, where what I would do is sometimes pan my closed hi-hats like a tiny little bit to the right, so there's a little bit louder on one side than it is on the other side. And then as opposed to that, I would have shakers, which are kind of in the same frequency field, and do the opposite with that, so that the sort of percussion just feels a little bit wider, because one does a little bit more on the left and the other one does a little bit more on the right. Also, if you have stuff that sits in the sort of upper mid-range, you can do, you know, you can go as weird as you want, basically, where stuff can come in from one side, swirl to the other side. You know, there's loads of these kind of sounds, or modulate stuff left and right. There's a lot possible. Again, but what I would say is that if you're playing music in a club, you know, systems in a club are very much sort of geared towards just left, just right. And so a lot of the sort of effects that you hear in the studio as being like beautifully swirling from left to right work only because your speakers are really close together and it doesn't feel like it's very interfering. But if you have like your speakers, say 25 meters away from each other, that sound, that effect is very different. So sometimes what sounds really nice in the studio and really high end doesn't work in a club at all, because you know, the stacks are so separate from each other. And so this is another reason why people, when they sort of think about stereo, they are quite hesitant to go too far either to the left or the right. Yeah, does that make sense, Marie? Yeah, okay, cool. All right, so now that we've sort of gone through the sort of two main phases of the mix, which is organize all your tracks in these sort of separate elements and level them, and then sort of go and sort of EQ every single group. We're going to be listening to the mix again, and what I usually do at this point is just go and sort of fine-tune a little bit, because now that we've sort of gone through the entire mixing process twice, first for leveling and then for EQing, most of the problems in the mix you know, should be already solved. But if not, then we can go into detail. And so in this case, for example, let's just play the track one more time, or play my loop. Maybe, you know, when I'm sort of listening to it now, and also because I know what the final edit sounds like, maybe those stabs could be a little bit more overpowering and the kick a little bit less. So in this case, what I could do is either, you know, fix that issue with just EQing or with leveling, or if that either of those things don't work, I can add a little bit of definition maybe to that stab by using a little bit of compression, you know, very soft compressor on the stab, so that you just get like a little bit more of a definition like this. For example, by just limiting a little bit. that sort of, yeah, maybe I would use a little bit of compression to sort of bring out that sort of attack a little bit more in the mix. But I think in this case, probably what I would do is just try and solve it with just EQing, and then sort of turn the kick drum down a little bit and sort of see if that helps, like this. So, you know, by sort of looking at sort of the little problems that sort of arise when you're sort of doing the mix, and sort of going back into the channels and sort of see if you can sort of help and sort of fix the problem by just EQing or like very gentle compression. That's usually how like I sort of try and sort of fit all the elements into my mix. And so, like I said, I sort of try and sort of have an approach where I do broad strokes first with that leveling. Then I sort of go to individual group EQing, and then if that doesn't solve the main issues of the mix, then I can go into maybe a separate channel and see if there's something that interferes. You know, for example, in this stab, you know, this is the sort of stab channel, so I can sort of see what is going on here. Let me see, or is that not the stab? Wait, this one. And then maybe I could sort of see if there's something that I did there that interferes with the mix, maybe like the reverb or whatever, like. Right, so in this case, maybe I could sort of like be a little bit more gentle on the effects here, and then it will sort of help the final mix, make it less cluttered sounding. So that's kind of usually how I do it. And then once I'm sort of done with sort of going into detail on these 6 groups, then, you know, everything goes to a master channel. As you can see, my master channel is a total mess. In this case, I would not advise you to do a mixdown this way. This was just to sort of give you like a little bit of an idea of what it would sound like in the end, right? So usually what I want to do is on the master channel, I just have my main EQ, because I do think you can just EQ on the master as well. This is just cleaning up, basically, you know, super low frequencies and the super high ones. Sometimes, and this is something that a lot of people might not advise you to do, but sometimes I do a little bit of broad strokes EQing on the master, and usually that has to do with if tracks have like more of a muddy kind of sound. Like a lot of my music has a lot of mid-range and lower mid-range, and sometimes in order to sort of keep it a little bit fresher, what you can do is sort of EQ something in this area here of say 200 to 600 or 200 to 800, which sometimes makes tracks sound really muddy and full. And so sometimes by cleaning that up a little bit, it sort of gives you a little bit more loudness and a little bit more power in return. I'll just sort of play the loop, and then you'll see what I mean once I sort of pull down or pull up that particular region. That when I pull down, you get that sort of car stereo mix, right, where it's just kick drums and hi-hats, and if you sort of pull it up, it becomes like full and sort of clogged sounding quite quickly, right? And so what I sometimes do is really gently, you know, add like a half a dB or 1 dB or something like that, just to give it like a little bit more warmth if I feel like I need it. And in this case, you know, where the track is quite clogged in that particular area, I could sort of go for, you know, like a -1 or -2, just to sort of give it like a little bit more punch and a little bit less of that sort of full feeling, you know, that when you're sort of listening, it feels automatically kind of overwhelming almost, right? And so this is usually what I do. Also, when I played the track out a few times, and you know, I mix it into like a Hassel audio track or something that has like no mid-range whatsoever, and then I'm like, wow, mine sounds way too full and too much, you know. And so that's a good way to sort of fix that problem and sort of unclog it a little bit. So sometimes I do that. Also, in very rare cases, you know, I feel like I need a little bit more freshness at the top. You know, sometimes you have tracks with loads of hi-hats in there and you don't need any extra EQing, but sometimes I only use 1 or 2 hi-hat channels and there's really not a lot of high frequency information, and so to just sort of push this up a little bit more, around like 8K or something, you know, to give it like a little bit more of a spark. See, I think in this case you have enough sort of high frequencies going on that you don't really need it, but it just gives it like a little bit more of a like a brightness, you know. So sometimes on the master channel, you know, kind of wild, but why not? Like if it works, right? This is a good way to sort of add like a little bit of character to the mix. Another thing is that in this case I use like a stock plugin, but different EQs have different types of character as well, you know, and sometimes you can use like a fancier EQ just on the master to just give it that warmth or give it like a little bit more of a punch. Like a really fun one that I like is this one, for example, a Pulsar W495, and you know, you can sort of like boost a little bit of sort of mid-range, you know, to give it like a bit more punch, for example. I don't know if you can hear it on here though, it's on Zoom, but so maybe hard to hear, but it's, you know, gives it like a little bit more warmth. Same with that sort of like high end, like this is a good way to add like a little bit of spark. There's a couple other ones that I really love, if we're just going for sort of plug-in advice anyway. Let me see, there is a Sound Toys one called SiQ, which is really nice. This one, super simple, sort of parametric EQ, where you can only do like big sweeps around certain frequency fields. So this one's quite nice, also gives it like a nice sort of warmth that I really like. But you know, you just sort of try out stuff, see what you're into, like what works for your kind of music as well. It's really important. But there are definitely a few fun ones that you know, give it like a little bit more of an edge, and especially once you start using the same plugins for all your mixes, it sort of helps to sort of hone like a little bit of a sound, you know, which I think is really important. So yeah, whatever you are into, definitely sort of stick to that particular plugin and sort of keep using it. Sometimes also I record my tracks into a Mackie desk and then back into the computer with no additional EQing, but just to sort of drive it a little bit hotter, so it gives me that sort of analog saturation that's sometimes nice. Usually I do that all the way at the end. I also recorded an album once on a reel-to-reel machine, which was a complete pain in the ass, but fun for the you know, for the sort of project vibes. Actually sort of use that as my sort of final mix. You know, not the greatest sounding, not very hi-fi sounding, but fun nevertheless. So there's different ways of sort of adding a little bit more character to the track. Okay, so once I've had sort of EQ on the master, and then maybe a sort of personality EQ, if you want to call it that, then sometimes I add limiters, and that's really just for the fact that I want to play the track out. You know, usually limiting on in a DAW is quite rough, and it just gives you a load of loudness, and sometimes makes the mix a little bit more muffled as well, in my opinion. And I would never advise to just sort of limit in the DAW and then just put it out that way. I have done that before, but it's not really advisable. Usually what I do is I just add the limiter to sort of make a version for myself to play out. But then once you send it to a proper mastering engineer, You just take off the limiter and let them, compress and limit themselves with far better equipment and far more knowledge than I will ever have. And so usually that delivers me a much cleaner and nicer result with the same loudness that I achieve with my limiting. So there's definitely a big difference between trying to do it yourself and just having a professional look at it. So that's usually where I sort of stop my mixing and sort of let the pros do what they're best at, So in this case, it's just like a standard stock limiter that I used. Let's see, which just gives me like a shitload of loudness, as you can see. And I try not to sort of mix into the limiter so that it's constantly limiting, that's usually a bad sign, because that's kind of where your dynamics start to disappear. But, like a little bit of peak limiting is usually enough to sort of give it like a little bit more of a body and a little bit more loudness. Another way to do that, and also to add like a little bit of character, is stuff like this. Devil Lock, it literally says audio level destroyer. So, take that as you will. I would never overuse this, but again, to give it like a tiny little bit more character, it could be nice to sort of give it like a bit more saturation, a bit more presence. But as you can see, like my mix is like at 1 or like 1.5 or something. I'll sort of pull it up a little bit so you can hear what this thing actually does. It just becomes a total mess. So again, what I usually do is sort of try and find like a little bit of character that I like, and then pull the mix all the way back to maybe just 1 or 1.5, just to give it like a sheen of sort of saturation that could be nice for for the mix. So that's usually like the sort of final details that I put on the master channel. Some people advise against putting anything on the master channel. And especially when you sort of send stuff to a mastering engineer, you want to sort of keep it clean. But I don't mind, if it's sort of for aesthetic purposes, I think you should keep stuff on the master channel. If it's for dynamics, then you take it off, because then a mastering engineer can do a way better job at delivering than you can ever do, at least if you're not a trained mastering engineer yourself. Okay. I think I've covered a lot. Sorry for rambling. Any questions about sort of mixdown workflow? Let's try and sort of tackle that first before people ask me questions about plugins. Workflows clear? Yeah? Okay, cool. So broad strokes first, then into EQing, then into EQing or compressing separate channels, and then to master bus, the last couple bits and pieces to sort of add character to the track and dynamics, and then you're pretty much there. So I wanted to sort of like try and sort of keep the process as clear as possible, so that there is a beginning and an end, and I think once you sort of are working on your master channel, try not to go back to separate channels or separate buses or whatever, and just sort of follow the process and sort of tweak it where you can, and then sort of let it go. That's very important. Any questions in general about the mixing process? Good to go? Wow. I look forward to some excellent mixdowns from all you guys. I collected a whole bunch of resources about mastering as well. I think mastering is really interesting, although it's not always the job of a musician to also master stuff, in my opinion. Mastering is more about sound and less about music. But it is very intriguing to see how there are different philosophies on how to master tracks and how to sort of approach the mastering process. So I collected a few interviews from famous people in the industry, people like Jason from Transition, Helmut, who used to work at Dubplates and Mastering, some other like luminaries in this field. Ron Murphy, who mixed and mastered all the sort of old Detroit classics, all the Jeff Mills, Underground Resistance, that kind of stuff. And so they all have very different approaches to the mastering process, which is kind of interesting. So I collected a bunch of videos and interviews, so I'll send that with the archive of this session for you to sort of dig into. I've also done 2 deeper dives about mastering. One with Daddy Kev, who masters all the sort of brain feeder related music, like and a lot of jazz nowadays as well, like Kamasi Washington and Thundercat, Flying Lotus, all that. He mastered one of my records as well once for brain feeder. And he talks a lot about EQing and reductive EQing as well. And then I also did a deeper dive with Jason from Transition, who mixed and mastered Burial, Code 9, all the basically classic dubstep, like 90% of all the classic dubstep. And he has a very, very different approach, but also super interesting to sort of hear about. Yes, Daddy Kev wrote a book. So basically my interview was a little bit before he did the book. I think the book is only about compression, which is nuts. Like, why would you do a book about compression? Oh, you have it, Alex. Cool. Nice. Yeah. So so he was writing the book when we did the interview, and then like a little bit later, a book came out. So definitely check that one out. Very and it's also a character. Every mastering engineer is a proper character. So definitely check that out. So I'll send you those links as well if you want to go deep. And in the meantime, enjoy mixing. Any struggles, any problems, please hit me up, or upload stuff in the work in progress section of the Discord, so we can take a look at it. But try and sort of keep the head cool, and just go through the steps, go through the motions. And like I said, the more you do it, the quicker you get at it, and the more you're in control of the process, which I think is really important. Have fun. Okay, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you on the next session. We're going to be talking about bass programming. That's going to be low frequencies next month. All right. See you soon, guys. Have fun and take care. Bye.